Good morning, everyone. It's tough to compete with the Panama, so thank you very much for being here. I was watching again last night Dr. Stern's presentation, and I noted with some interest the fact that, remember, she said that the crocodiles at some point had all disappeared. So I went and did a little bit more research, and I found out that's right. In fact, they did disappear. But again, knowing to the nature of the species, I'm pleased to be able to tell you that they were replaced by lawyers. And speaking of that, I'd actually done a little bit more research, and I found out that in the American states, American jurisdictions of New York, Florida, and California, social science researchers, actually prefer using lawyers rather than rats for their experiments and their testing. So I did a little bit more depth inquiry into it, and I found out there were 3 reasons why the researchers preferred lawyers to rats. Firstly, they found that in all 3 jurisdictions, there were more lawyers than rats. Secondly, they found, again, in the 3 jurisdictions, that the researchers really started to develop an affinity. They actually started to like the rats they were working with. And the third that really amazed me is that they found that, again, in some of the experiments, there were certain things that rats refused to do. When we ended yesterday, very briefly, I talked about the resolution the vote that was taking place in the General Assembly to have Russia removed from the UN Human Rights Council. For those who didn't follow it, and the General Assembly would have had to have a 2/3 vote to expel Russia from the Human Rights Council. Russia, as of yesterday afternoon, has been expelled from the Human Rights Council. And you know something? Kudos to the General Assembly. We're going to talk this morning about peacekeeping and how it's evolved. And to put it perhaps in some context, just so that we have a general understanding, I can tell you that as of this year, since 1948, there have been 71 UN peacekeeping/peacemaking, peace enforcement missions. And for all of those, there have been actually 121 countries that have contributed forces directly to UN peacekeeping missions. Now, as of this year, there are currently 87,000 plus soldiers wearing green helmets in 12 UN operations, and we'll see that later. But since 1948, approximately 1,500 UN soldiers have fallen in the line of duty. This is an interesting picture. This particular picture that I use sort of just as the general is a photograph of a UN patrol in Bangui in the Central African Republic. And we'll see, for example, that the UN vehicle, in this case it's an armored personnel carrier, is painted white. And more particularly, I'm always impressed with this, because here is an enlisted soldier, but for those of us who wore in the uniform, you'll see that he actually has his finger outside of the trigger guard. And that tells me that that soldier has been properly trained. So we're going to talk about the evolution, the development, and I use the term peace and stability operations, peacekeeping, peacemaking, because as we go a little further, we'll see that there is a difference between peacekeeping as such and peacemaking. So we're going to follow sort of this line. And the early stages of our peacemaking, peace building, peace enforcement, and they really would fall under the rubric of what I will call sort of the heavy, the more robust portion of it. But as we've seen since 1940, really since 1946, 47, since the earliest iterations of UN peace operations of any sort, it traditionally started in traditional peacekeeping. And I use the word peacekeeping because, firstly, there has to be a peace to keep before there can be peacekeeping. So in fact, and we'll see in a moment the evolutionary stages, But now we're in an environment, particularly since the year 2000, where peacekeeping is a much more complex operation. It's much more complex. It's no longer just sort of sending in soldiers to keep parties separate. It now is very much sort of societal development, and both physical and non-physical. This is an interesting chart because, and this comes really from NATO doctrine, but it's equally applicable to UN doctrine. And if we look at the red column, the red side, that really shows the escalation of violence, where on the green side it shows where there has been peace or nonviolence. So in the early stages, we see, for example, there is peacemaking over here on the left-hand side, and really that's people at the discussion trying to resolve issues. The second then is, quote, peace building, and we'll see now there is some sort of military intervention, and we see then that there's civil disturbance. But as the conflict, as the violence tend to increase, there's a greater need for humanitarian assistance. And here we've used the term from the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, because what happens is when there's violence, there's displacement of civilians. Then we come to peacekeeping, and that really means that, again, there has been an agreement as between the parties, and whether it's international parties or parties within a country, that is where there has been what's called a non-international conflict. The parties have agreed to some truce, to some peace, and the military forces are there to keep that peace, to keep the parties separate, but also to provide stability for the civilian populations. And the final one, where there is the high portion of red, that's peace enforcement. That's under Chapter 7, and that is when there's a UN operation that's been sent in really to create an environment where there will be peace. And those operations are very, very robust. The logo in the bottom right-hand corner is the logo of the Canadian Armed Forces Peace Support Training Center. It's located at Canadian Forces Base Kingston, and I can tell you that that is where I received my qualifications as although it wasn't my primary trade when I was in uniform, I was qualified as a civil military affairs operator and staff officer. This is the UN definition of peacekeeping, and I put the blue helmet is up there for a reason, because really what it shows is what's peacekeeping. It's with the consent of the parties to a conflict, whether it's an international conflict or an internal conflict, and the peacekeeping is either to stop, presumably, or at least constrain the violence, but also to supervise an agreement of some sort that's been put in place, and then to assist with humanitarian relief. Not to provide humanitarian relief, but rather to assist or to create the environment where humanitarian relief operations can take place. So what are the common elements of a peacekeeping operations? Well, one, it operates with international forces. So the UN will call upon different countries and it will send out invitations to different countries to participate in a peacekeeping operation. And it will send out invitations to different countries looking for a particular trade or qualification. So for some countries, it may send out a request for engineers. For others, it may send out for hospital units. For others, it may send out for an infantry or an air unit. Each country will provide a particular unit. It may be up to battalion size. There is always then, again, in peacekeeping, between the military side and the civilian side, there's always some participation or partnership. And when I say civilian side, because on any UN operation, there is both the military side, but there's also always sort of at the top of the chain, there's the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN. The acronym for him or her is SRSG. And he really is, he's the one who deals directly with the overall force commander. When they go in, there has to be impartiality. And firstly, there has to be consent for the peacekeeping operation to take place. The Security Council cannot, in and of its own volition, authorize a peacekeeping operation without the consent of the parties to be affected. They're impartial, not neutral, but impartial. So we talk about neutral. When we look at the only absolutely neutral body in any conflict area we're going to see is the Red Cross. And it is usually, well, if the Red Cross we'll see is the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, not necessarily the Red Cross that we would see in our domestic jurisdictions. And then they go into always, again, in peacekeeping with what's called the minimum force. Because, again, in peacekeeping, it's to create to allow an environment where peace has, in some force, been established, and an overall sort of heavy boots on the ground picture is not one that is conducive to the creation of a peaceful, at least to the maintenance of a peaceful environment. Having said that, it is always a soldier's right, absolute right, to engage in self-defense. So if a soldier is being shot at, he has the right to return fire only for purposes of self-defense. And that's been also established, or at least increased, to provide protection or defense for those that are under that particular soldier's protection, that particular unit's protection. The first of the UN models of peacekeeping really were the observer models, and we always sort of think about what happened in sort of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. But in fact, there were a number that went before that, and I've got an interesting photograph of one of the patrols of the UN Expeditionary Force. Remember what happened in the Suez Canal in 1948 when it was initially nationalized. Then there was a force that came in composed of British and French forces. And one of the things that sort of developed after that is the separation, and the UN then created the UNAF, the United Nations Expeditionary Force, in 1956. We've then seen the change sort of again from the 50s, 60s through the 70s into the 80s, where we then had multidimensional peacekeeping. And that is when it was multidimensional, there were so many different components brought in, not just military, but civilian components or NGO and related components, but would all operate under the UN umbrella, not necessarily under UN command, but at least under UN coordination. And the last we then see, and we'll go a little further, is what's called transitional administration. This is really what we're doing now, save it except for those that are very heavy military presence, where we're trying to take, the UN is trying to take countries that have been in a state of chaos, civil war, failed states, whatever we may want to call them, and move them into a modern functioning society. And there the UN will have a multidimensional component. It'll be composed of both civilian and military components that will deal with both the, what I call the soft infrastructure, elections, constitutions, the development of social structures, as well as the physical structures, bridges, highways, dams, things of that nature. And the best two examples, well, we all remember what happened in the former Yugoslavia in the late 90s and in Kosovo, and then also in East Timor. This is a photograph that was really one of the first UN missions along the Palestine-Israel border and Jordan. And the soldier wearing the garrison hat with glasses, he actually is a Belgian soldier. The first observers were, in fact, Belgian soldiers, and you can see then that there are there's another Belgian in behind. He's the one with the radio. You can see the small antenna there, and it looks like either a British or an Israeli soldier, and it looks like they found something, perhaps a mine, and we can see that the Belgian is actually taking notes of it. As I've gone through these photographs, I've tried to find out who is the chap wearing the pith helmet. And for the life of me, I've gone through all of my research material, and the only thing I could think of is that he must have been Belgian, because he looks sort of semi-Caucasian. None of the Jordanians were wearing that type of uniform headdress. So what did the early observer missions do? And they were there to observe, to modify, and they were there sort of to supervise, but only to supervise. They had no force, save it except sort of from their own will. They were conciliators. They were conciliators, not mediators, but conciliators, and they were unarmed. They were what we call the soldier diplomats. So they were there to observe, to keep the parties to a conflict, or at least to a post-conflict, talking. And again, that was peacekeeping, not peacemaking and not peace enforcement. The earliest actually go back to 1946, a year after the UN was established, and it dealt with the problem with the former Yugoslavia and Greece and Turkey. In that area, there was a commission established to deal with the issue in the Balkans. The Balkans have always remained sort of a source of some interest to the UN. Then there was Indonesia, again, and this is the post-war period, but there was a consular commission in 1947, and then actually a formal commission in 1949. There was a good officers commission that was done in between, and it was sort of off and on. It tried to have the good officers of the parties talking. At times it was successful, at times it wasn't successful. Then Korea. Interesting enough, long before the Korean conflict in 1947, again, we're talking the post-war period, there was a temporary commission on Korea because, remember, the border was separated, and then there was the formal commission on Korea in 1948, and then we all know that in 1951, the UN Security Council authorized, quote, the police mission, but again, it was under Chapter 7 into Korea. The earliest sort of major mission was one that took place again in the Middle East. It was, again, before Israel was created, there was the Commission on Palestine. And then we see in 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, there was the first Truce Commission. And then they developed, again, there was the Truce Supervision Organization in 1948. And then the Conciliation Commission that followed in 1948. And so all of those were really non-starters. Kashmir. Very few people know that really from 1948 on, there has been a UN presence in the Kashmir area in the north of India, because that follows the withdrawal of. Pardon me for a moment. I apologize. From the time that India and Pakistan were created, there was always a presence along the border in the north, and that sort of border between India and Pakistan is effectively referred to as the line of control. Remember that there's been conflict between India and Pakistan for, I think now, 4 times, and the problem that makes that area so very difficult is that there's India, Pakistan, and then in the northeast corner, there's also a small there's also a small border area with China. Well, I beg your pardon, for some reason or other, my computer has frozen. There we go. The first then of sort of the formal quote peacekeeping missions as such, as we would understand it, took place in took place as a result of the Suez Crisis. And the two real authors of modern peacekeeping are Dag Hammarskjöld and Lester Pearson, the former Prime Minister of Canada. Interesting enough, Lester Pearson, remember that Dag Hammarskjöld was the only Secretary General who was actually killed or died in the line of duty, and he was killed in a plane crash when he was trying to, on his way to Congo, to try and deal with the problem, to quote, the old Belgian Congo. Lester Pearson received for his work in creating at least he's called the father of modern peacekeeping, he received a Nobel Peace Prize as a result of his efforts. And interesting enough, his Nobel Peace Prize is now contained in the Department of Global Affairs in Ottawa. We in Canada every so often change the names of our ministries just to keep people guessing and to keep the printing presses going so that the paper goes, stationery goes out to tender, things like this. So we have to keep the economy going in Canada. his Nobel Peace Prize, and actually, and it's a very large medal. It's almost 6 inches in diameter. Actually, sits in an enclosed case in the Department of Global Affairs in Ottawa. This is a picture of the again as a result of their of the creation again of the UNEF, the United Nations Expeditionary Force. This is a patrol that was going through the Sinai, and interesting enough, again, they appear to be well trained. You can see that there's appropriate spacing is between at least the first 3 or 4 going down the hill, and you can tell that the officer on the far left is an officer. He doesn't have a rifle. He probably just has his own sidearm. One of the longer ones that's still in operation, much like, for example, the presence in Kashmir along the line of control, is in Cyprus. And Cyprus, for a number of years, has really been considered sort of one of the easy posts of UN operations. The photograph or the map on the top is what Cyprus looked like prior to the Turkish invasion of 1974. Subsequent to the Turkish invasion of 1974, you'll see along the bottom of the picture what looks like that sort of broken line. That, in fact, is the line of control, and it divides Cyprus between the Greek area and the Turk area. And every so often, there are some gunshots that go across, more just to see if the UN observers are awake. This is a photograph, actually, of the green line. And again, the armored personnel carrier, you'll see now that it's in white, and all UN vehicles are in white. And just to briefly sort of go off a bit, when a UN force is created by each of whatever country it is, that particular country will take whatever vehicles that are going to be sent over. They're taken out of their normal operational line, are separated, and they'll go through and they're painted white. And the interesting thing is that they're only given UN. They're not given the French equivalent of United Nations. So it only has the UN and not the French acronym. Another one that's been going on since 1978 as a result of the conflicts in the north of Israel is the UN presence in southern Lebanon, and it's still there. And it really came about again as a result of a very real conflict that developed and the Israeli incursion into South Lebanon. If we remember, the Israeli army or the Israelis had sort of fostered. It was called the South Lebanese Army under the control of a General Haddad, and he actually had. There were two Palestinian refugee camps, Shatila and Sabra. The Israelis stood by and allowed the South Lebanese army to go in and commit atrocities in these two camps. As a result of that, a number of Israelis were held to account as a result of a commission of inquiry that took place in Israel. None of the officers or politicians were ever punished, but it led then to the creation of this particular UN operation that still is in place now. This is very interesting. There was, if we remember, there was a conflict between Addis Ababa and Eritrea in the late 1990s into 2000, and it led to the creation of the UN peacekeeping force that was there for about 8 or 9, I guess for 8 years. And what's interesting is when we look to see where Eritrea is, we see Eritrea in the north, Addis in the Ethiopia in the south. Then look directly across. We have Yemen, and it is a constant source. It's an ongoing conflict. And just to the right of Ethiopia is Somalia. When we look at that part of the world, that is an ongoing tinderbox. The interesting thing, of course, is that while there was a conflict some years ago as between Ethiopia and Eritrea, in the most recent civil disturbance, civil war that took place in Ethiopia, the Eritrean army came in to support the Ethiopian army to try and deal with some of the Tigray unrest and Tigray sort of civilian army that had been created and actually came very close to attacking the capital Addis. One of the little side notes to that is that the reason that the Ethiopian army was successful was they had received armed drones from, of all places, Turkey, obviously a NATO member. The Tigray had no air power at all, no air force whatsoever, and the Ethiopian army were able to use these drones very effectively, these armed drones, as against the Tigray army, the Tigray sort of revolutionary army that had actually been very successful moving down towards Addis. So now we come to multidimensional operations. And these are photographs that came actually from East Timor in the early 2000s. And naval operations take place really in sort of both a large capacity, and we see sort of a cutter, a small patrol boat, again on the right. And again, we see only the acronym UN, and of course the vehicle, or the ship is painted white. And we see the same thing on the lower photograph on the left. And what I've always found interesting is that even though this was it's a maritime operation, we see that the soldier on the left, and I can tell you he's wearing a Canadian Army uniform, and yet he's in a naval operation. The interesting thing about the photograph in the upper right, again, it's part of the operation in East Timor, but we'll see maritime or naval operations really are both large but also small. So here was a small sort of Zodiac, for lack of a better description, Zodiac really dealing with coming into a small village. We see children there. What's interesting too is that the 3 UN military personnel are not wearing helmets. So what they've tried to do is to portray that they're there sort of not to intimidate, but rather to show a presence, that they're there to almost provide some sense of security, but not necessarily a hard presence. There's always an air component to every UN operation, and firstly, the one on the upper left is obviously we see a heavy lift aircraft, and it's used primarily to transport UN personnel, but also from time to time it will also support humanitarian aid. It won't deliver; it won't actually be providing humanitarian aid as such, but rather it will assist in the delivery, at least to advanced positions for others who will be actually distributing the military aid. The photograph on the bottom right, and I've used intelligence because intelligence has two very broad components, or a number of components. And one obviously is to see, quote, where the bad guys are, whoever they may or may not be, but also now too in today's era of conflict, what civilians are moving where, and how many are actually being moved or are moving. And that's important because it's important for the other agencies that are there to provide assistance. They have to know, or should know, where people are moving so that they can participate in advance in the preparation. So it isn't just, for example, UN High Commissioner for Refugees or UN Women or UNICEF, but any number of the other NGOs that are going to be in presence to see and anticipate what the needs are going to be. And lest there be no confusion, there also is a military component to deal with and wherever necessary for both a defensive posture as well as an offensive posture, to use military ordnance to secure or enforce the peace. CIMIC, Civil Military Relations. CIMIC is what's called in technical terms, a force multiplier, because it allows the staff level to meet with those that they're going to be dealing with on the other side of the table. And it really allows the force to find out what the needs are, particularly from the political side. And this is a photograph taken from Kosovo. Now, this is a very interesting picture because the chap on the second from the right, see, wearing glasses, holding a notepad, he's a Canadian. He was a Canadian, And he actually his name is Maurice Berry. He subsequently became the Canadian Chief of Defense Staff. The chap sitting next to him, he's slightly behind wearing glasses, you'll see that he has a blue baseball cap in front of him. He is in all likelihood at a meeting of that level. He's the special representative of the Secretary General. He's a civilian. He's not a military person. But at the end of the day, he represents the Security Council at any of these meetings that take place. And you'll see, again, they're all military, save and except, again, the chap at in the upper right-hand corner. He's another civilian. And interesting, he doesn't have a blue hat with him. So he may represent one of the other NGO or related agencies that are there working. So what's multidimensional peacekeeping? It brings a whole bunch of things together. And I suppose the military is the one that creates the physical environment where all of the others can take place. But when we talk about states that have gone to serious internal conflict, or we may even now look at any of the countries that have serious conflicts where a UN peacekeeping force or peacemaking force has gone in, what we're now seeing is that the UN provides an umbrella so that all of these others can take place. So, for example, where we have a political side, then we know that there's going to be integration with both police reconstruction, police and judicial. So it isn't just a military side. It isn't just security sector reform, but it's also justice sector reform. There has to be humanitarian aid because, again, if the civilian population doesn't have food, medicine, access to electricity and clean water, there's going to be ongoing disturbance and unrest. And again, there has to be reconstruction, both physical and both hard and soft reconstruction, but also, too, an economy has to be brought to stand on its own 2 feet, or at least to become at least semi-stable. So these are all the components that are now involved in multidimensional peacekeeping. It's now a very, very complex business. To observe borders, and it isn't just external borders, it's borders as between the parties. Because again, and we saw, for example, the helicopter for intelligence purposes, but this is very close up. I can tell you that, to the best of my knowledge, they are not peeping Toms. Protecting strategic sites. Now, when I say about protecting strategic sites, I'm not just talking about military sites. I'm talking about sites that also are important to the civilian infrastructure, power dams, electrical generating stations, radio television transmission towers. All of these things are strategic because, for example, if communication towers are down, how do ambulances communicate with each other? How do we deal with internet? So it isn't just the military strategic sites; it's strategic sites for the entire social structure of the country to be affected. Self-protection. It's fundamental. It's fundamental in any military operation that a soldier has the right of self-defense. But that's now been expanded because since 2000, every UN mandate has as its prime component what's called protection of civilians. The nomenclature is POC, protection of civilians. So what then happens is it isn't just the soldiers that have the right of self-defense, but rather they have the right to step forward and to protect those who they're mandated to protect from adverse forces. And this takes place particularly now we see in operations that are taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are very substantial rebel forces, and the UN operators take a very strong position to protect the civilians as against attack from what when I'm training in French, I'll refer to as the les méchants, the bad guys. My American, I put this picture in because this to me is important. Whereas the United States has not of late participated in UN operations as such, they did participate in the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. And I can tell you that I've worked both in uniform and afterwards training with my American colleagues, both in uniform, both in active uniform and retired. I will tell you that to a man, it has been a privilege and a pleasure for me to work with my American military colleagues. And I put this up because this particular picture is important to me, and I hope you appreciate what I've said. So, civil military assistance. What happens? In every conflict situation, there's been a destruction of civil infrastructure. So what we're seeing now is military units being sort of co-opted to work to do civilian reconstruction projects. Example here is in former Cambodia. There was a UN operation, and we'll see again, this is interesting enough, this is an earth mover, and yet it's painted white, but we'll notice that and even though it's painted white, the soldiers that are there are still wearing their helmets, which means that there's a possibility of some conflict. So what else happens? Humanitarian assistance. Well, humanitarian assistance is only when the other agencies charged with providing humanitarian assistance are unable or, quote, unwilling to do it. Then the military will step forward to do it, but also, too, as part of a UN operation, we'll often find, for example, UNICEF, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and others that are there to work with and coordinated with the military side to provide humanitarian assistance. And one of the things that the military side always is there to do is to provide the environment so that humanitarian assistance can take place. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR. This is one of the real challenges. Whenever a rebel group is either surrendered or otherwise, the first part of it obviously is disarm them. The second then part is to demobilize them, to take them out of their formed structures and then put them into an environment where they can be reintegrated into society, into whatever the local society is. And then, of course, we have a reintegration. The real challenge in DDR is dealing with child soldiers, because often child soldiers have been sort of co-opted into that environment at the ages of 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12, and it's all they've known for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years. To then take that child, that young person, who all he knows is that type of environment where nothing else of violence, and being part of a unit that really sort of kills, to take that child, that young person out, and firstly disarm him, but secondly then try and reintegrate him. And remember, a lot of these children have never been to school since they've been co-opted into the child soldier regime. One of the worst offenders in this particular thing is now was the Lord's Resistance Army, and the author of that is currently an accused before the International Criminal Court. Human rights. Human rights are also one of the prime components of every UN mission that's been established since 2000. And the way it sort of works is that the Security Council will authorize a UN mission to be created, and it will sort of set out the broad guidelines of what the mission is to do, or perhaps not do, but more from a positive point of view, what is to do. And the first thing they want, obviously, is the protection of civilians, and then to create an environment where humanitarian assistance can be delivered. But then as they go further down, 2 or 3 points further down, always human rights are there. So I guess that takes us back perhaps to the first instance of the creation of the UN, when human rights was important, and now it's being built into every UN peacekeeping mission. And interesting enough, even UN peacekeeping missions that were in place before 2000, the mandates come up for renewal every couple of years or so. And so when the mandates come up for renewal, if protection of civilians and human rights weren't in the original mandates, they're built into the subsequent mandate amendments. And the last, of course, is elections, because one of the things that, again, the UN tries to do in any mission is not just the boots on the ground, but to create the environment where a society can function. And a society should be able to function with a series of elections to choose who is going to govern. Do we need more robust peacekeeping? The answer, in my view, is yes. And let me go back. I put Chapter 7 up. There are the 2 operative chapters in the UN Charter are Chapters 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 deals with peacekeeping, and we saw that in the graph. And it really shows where there's an agreement of some sort between the parties, and the UN is there to quote to keep that peace, perhaps to enforce that peace, to act as conciliators, do any number of other things, and also to provide the general environment where the economy or society can develop. Chapter 7 is different. Chapter 7 is an authorization from the Security Council to go in and use force to create an environment. Not to keep an environment, rather to create an environment where other things can then happen. Chapter 7 is one that is replete with force, and each unit that goes in will have what are called its own rules of engagement as to the use, when force can be used. There then is that blurred line between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. And often what we now see is that those that are sent in under Chapter 7, they will perhaps reduce the amount of force that they will use. Not that they have in their toolbox to use, but they will use, and that's often called sort of Chapter 6.5. Have there been some things where there have been problems? Well, we all remember what happened in Somalia, and that didn't do well. In Rwanda, Rwanda was really a failure, and this is the picture on the left is General Romeo Dallaire, subsequently became a senator. He was the force commander in Rwanda, and he's the one who first alerted DPKO New York headquarters that the genocide was developing, and he received no support, and in fact he called the genocide. He saw what was happening even before, as it was developing, was reporting it to New York, and in fact New York sat on its hands and did nothing. Then we have Bosnia, the former failure of the former Yugoslavia. The picture on the right is a picture of a Canadian officer who was actually being tied to a post on a bridge, and the Serbs were of the position that if the Canadian officer was being used as a human shield, that bridge wouldn't be blown up. This is a picture of downtown Sarajevo afterwards, and I can tell you that that's what it looked like. I was in Sarajevo in 2001. The fighting was when the conflict was going on, hand to hand, quite literally building to building, room to room. And it was very common to see pictures like that. So we go to transitional administration. The officers, the policemen on the left are police from their own home jurisdiction. So they're wearing their national uniforms, and here, again, this is in the former Yugoslavia, and the uniformed officers on wearing the non-blue headgear are the local police, and they're engaged in what's called justice sector reform. And justice sector reform is police, prosecutors, courts, defense, even to the correctional or prison systems. And it encompasses all of these things. And then we talk about how the general population is going to reduce itself. This is a picture that came from former East Timor, and it showed how weapons were being gathered, and then there's a particular sort of procedure how weapons actually are destroyed, and they're taken and they will not end up in the black market. There's a particular protocol that calls for the destruction of weapons. Demobilization and reintegration, of course, is that in many cases is really left to particular civilian agencies that have expertise in this effect. The Norwegian, there are a group of Norwegians that go in this. There's a very strong German presence in this. There is a Swedish presence in this. These are the current UN operations that are present today. And this is as of the late 2021. I've had the privilege, I use the word privilege, of working as a trainer for units that had gone into Abyei, into South Sudan, the DRC Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Mali. Working in any and training these units to go into UN standard because they were African Union troops, and in many cases, again, going into the African Union participation in UN missions in Africa. We go back a little bit in history. The AU, the African Union, was originally charged with its own peacekeeping missions in Africa, in some of these conflict areas. They were incapable of doing it, either by logistical or resource or other training. So subsequently, the UN took over those missions, and so subsequently the African Union soldiers ceased to wear their ordinary headgear, wore blue helmets, but the interesting thing is that on any African mission, the position of the UN is there always will be an African presence. Are they the best trained troops that are there on any of the missions? I'll pass on that question. I've asked myself. We're sort of coming to the end, but if we go back then to the first slide, remember, to the green and the red. The gray bar on the top shows the nature of the escalation of the conflict, and you see at the gray bar on the top how it's at its highest. But if then we look at the bottom on the blue, we can see what takes place as that conflict goes along. And we see, for example, again, the early warning and the bottom, the peacemaking and preventative action. But in fact, then we look to the far right, and we see reconciliation and justice. Well, in fact, peacemaking, reconciliation, and justice really aren't that far apart, as is peace building. So the real challenge takes place sort of in that center between humanitarian relief, because humanitarian relief has to go hand in hand with traditional peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace enforcement. Why humanitarian relief? Because soldiers take care of themselves. That's part of what we did. But it's the civilians that are always at risk. So therefore, part of the real mandate is the providing the environment so that humanitarian relief can take place, so that those who are incapable of really providing for themselves can have those necessities. But underneath that too, let's be very clear, there is peace enforcement. That's Chapter 7. That's not Chapter 6. It's Chapter 7. Who are the other groups that engage? NATO. Now, we're all very aware now of what's happening with NATO or not happening as far as Ukraine is concerned. But NATO has two operative sections. One is Article 5. The attack against one is attack against all. But then there's what's called non-Article 5. And non-Article 5 provides for the ability for NATO to respond, to provide work outside of the country, in various peacekeeping efforts. And this is an ongoing planning situation, ongoing planning and ongoing training. How do I know that? I've had the privilege of working in Norway, in Stavanger, at the NATO Joint Warfare Center, where plans were taking place. And NATO, by the way, has always 2 standby headquarters units ready to go. And there's constant planning on how NATO is going to move in and assist in peacekeeping or peacemaking operations at the request primarily of the UN. The OSCE, it provides civilian resource. The EU, there was a French unit, interesting enough, that has just pulled out of Mali because of the coup and the inability of the Malian government to deal with the French. The African Union, yes, well, there's always one AU unit in place on any UN mission. How do I know? Well, I was there. This was the last day before a Cameroon battalion was on its way to the Central African Republic. And there I am at my best. So we started off talking about Dr. Stern and crocodiles, and look how we've ended up. As always, thank you for joining me this morning. I hope I've given you something.